Hello. I thought my first job would be simple. Steady hours, safe choices. But one glance from him changed everything. Some lines, once crossed, lead you to places you never imagined. The cold wind pushed against Aiden Wolf as he stepped through the glass doors of Hart Company, his new workplace. The building was a towering symbol of modern design, all steel and sharp angles, but inside, it was warm and humming with quiet energy. He tightened his grip on the strap of his messenger bag, nerves prickling under his skin. This was his first day, the start of everything he had worked so hard to achieve. Stability, progress, maybe even pride. He barely had time to soak in the sleek lobby before a tall figure caught his attention. Across the room, near the reception desk, stood Julian Hart himself, the firm's senior architect. Aiden had seen his photo during the interview process, but photographs had not done him justice. Julian had a presence that filled the space around him without effort. He was dressed sharply, but there was a relaxed elegance to him, like he didn't have to try to command attention. It simply happened. Their eyes met briefly, and Aiden felt an unexpected jolt, like the flicker of static electricity. Julian's gaze was steady, unreadable, and Aiden quickly looked away, pretending to fumble with his phone. It was nothing, he told himself, just first-day jitters. The morning passed in a blur of handshakes, orientation documents, and quick tours around the sprawling office. Aiden was introduced to the team, assigned a desk not far from the large corner office with frosted glass panels. Every now and then, he caught glimpses of Julian moving about, discussing projects, reviewing designs, speaking in a low voice that somehow carried an air of certainty. By lunchtime, Aiden found himself alone in the break room, nursing a cup of bitter coffee. The place was nearly empty, the quiet buzz of a few conversations floating from the hall. As he stared out the window, letting his mind drift, he felt the subtle awareness of being watched. He turned, and there he was again, Julian, standing just inside the door, as if debating whether to come in. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Julian offered a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before walking to the counter to prepare his own coffee. No words were exchanged, but something hung in the air between them, a sense of recognition, though they were still strangers. Aiden returned to his desk with a head full of questions he couldn't quite name. He tried to bury himself in the tasks he had been assigned, focusing on blueprints and zoning regulations. Yet, despite his efforts, he remained aware of every movement beyond his line of sight, every soft footstep that might be Julian passing by. Late in the afternoon, an email notification blinked at the corner of his screen. It was a request for a team meeting, and Julian's name was at the top of the invite list. Aiden's heart gave an odd, fluttering beat. He swallowed it down and gathered his notes. The conference room was filled with muted conversation when he arrived. Julian stood at the far end of the table, discussing a model on the screen with a few senior team members. Aiden slipped into a seat near the back, doing his best to appear invisible. Yet, midway through the meeting, Julian's eyes found his. Just for a second, just long enough to make Aiden's stomach tighten with something he didn't want to examine. The meeting ended, the team dispersed, and the building began to empty as evening approached. Aiden stayed behind to organize his notes, telling himself it was just to make a good impression. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Julian's approach until he was standing right beside his desk. "Good work today," Julian said quietly. His voice was calm, almost soothing. Aiden looked up, caught off guard by the closeness. There was an ease in Julian's posture, a quiet confidence that made the world feel a little smaller, a little more focused. "Thank you," Aiden managed to say, his voice steadier than he felt. Julian's gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he offered a faint, approving smile and moved on, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Aiden sat frozen for a moment, the interaction playing over in his mind. It had been ordinary, professional, and yet, underneath the simple words and casual nod, there was an undercurrent he couldn't explain. That night, as Aiden lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he replayed every detail of the day, every glance, every brush of awareness. He told himself it was foolish, that there was nothing there, that he was simply overwhelmed by the newness of it all. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered otherwise. Something had started, and whether he was ready for it or not, it was already pulling him in. The following days blurred into a rhythm of project deadlines, design revisions, and muted conversations in the hallways. Aiden fell into the pace of the office quickly, working long hours, always trying to stay a step ahead. But despite the demands of the job, he found his focus slipping at times, drawn inevitably toward the presence of Julian Hart. He was always there, somewhere nearby, an unspoken weight in the atmosphere that Aiden couldn't quite shake. One evening, the sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had darkened to a deep shade of blue, and most of the office had emptied out. Aiden remained behind, hunched over his desk, illuminated by the soft glow of his monitor. He was reviewing final renderings for a presentation due the next morning, determined to make a good impression. The click of footsteps drew his attention, and he looked up to see Julian crossing the open floor. He moved with effortless confidence, his jacket slung over his arm, tie loosened at the collar. There was something different about him after hours, a certain ease that wasn't present during the day. Their eyes met briefly, and Julian gave a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them had left yet. Minutes stretched into an hour. The office was so quiet that Aiden could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the building settling. Immersed in his work, he barely noticed when Julian reappeared, a takeaway coffee cup in hand. Without a word, Julian placed it on Aiden's desk. It was a simple gesture, but it made Aiden's chest tighten unexpectedly. He mumbled a thanks, but Julian just offered a faint smile and moved to sit at a table nearby, spreading out blueprints. They worked in companionable silence, the hours slipping by unnoticed. At some point, Aiden realized he had stopped focusing on his screen. His gaze wandered to Julian, watching the way he leaned over his work, the furrow of concentration between his brows. There was a stillness to him, a quiet intensity that made it hard to look away. When the clock crept past 10, Julian finally leaned back, stretching his arms behind him. The movement drew Aiden's eyes again, and he quickly dropped his gaze, pretending to scribble notes. "You're committed," Julian said, his voice breaking the quiet. Aiden looked up, startled by the comment. Julian wasn't looking at him, but there was a hint of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. Aiden shrugged, unsure how to respond. "It's good," Julian added after a moment, his tone softer. "Not everyone is." There was a weight to the words, something unspoken behind them. Aiden sensed that Julian wasn't just talking about work. The minutes stretched between them, heavy with unacknowledged tension. Finally, Julian stood, gathering his papers. "Don't stay too late," he said, his voice quiet. Aiden nodded, and Julian's hand lingered for a moment on the back of a chair as he hesitated, as if wanting to say more. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the elevator. The silence he left behind felt heavier than before. Aiden sat for a long while, staring at the coffee cup Julian had left him. It was a simple thing, easily dismissed, but it carried a weight far beyond its size. It spoke of an awareness, a small, deliberate act that meant more than either of them had said aloud. When Aiden finally packed up for the night, the city outside was cloaked in darkness, the streets slick with a light rain. As he walked to the subway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. Over the next week, the late hours became more frequent. Meetings bled into the evening, deadlines loomed larger, and the number of people staying past regular hours dwindled. More and more often, it was just Aiden and Julian left behind. They rarely spoke during those evenings, but the silence between them grew less empty, more charged. There were moments when Aiden would catch Julian watching him with an unreadable expression, moments when a passing touch, an accidental brush of hands over a blueprint, a hand on a shoulder in silent encouragement, would leave Aiden's skin tingling long after the contact ended. It was during one of those late nights, after a brutal project review, that Julian approached Aiden's desk again. The office was a sea of shadows, the overhead lights dimmed to conserve energy. Julian rested one hand lightly on Aiden's desk, leaning in slightly. His presence was overwhelming, the faint scent of rain and coffee clinging to his clothes. "Come take a break," he said quietly. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Aiden hesitated only a second before rising to follow him. They walked through the deserted office, their footsteps the only sound. Julian led him to a small balcony tucked away behind a service hallway, one Aiden hadn't even known existed. The city sprawled out before them, lights blinking in the misty rain. They stood side by side in the cool air, not speaking. There was no need. The silence between them said everything. Aiden glanced over at Julian, catching a rare softness in his profile. It made something inside him ache, a longing he didn't dare name. In that quiet, suspended moment, with the city breathing around them, the unspoken understanding between them deepened. No promises, no declarations. Just a fragile connection, tentative but real. Aiden knew, standing there in the mist and darkness, that something was building between them. Slowly, steadily, with the same quiet force that shaped the skyline before them. Something he could no longer pretend he didn't feel. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension that buzzed beneath the surface. Aiden moved through his work with a focus that felt almost fragile, easily broken whenever he sensed Julian's presence nearby. The late nights continued, but something had shifted. The moments of silence between them grew heavier, charged with things neither of them dared to say aloud. It was on a Friday evening, as most of the staff trickled out for the weekend, that Aiden found himself summoned to Julian's office. The email had been brief, almost casual, but Aiden knew better by now. He gathered his notes, though he suspected they wouldn't be needed. Julian's office was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the polished floor. He was standing by the window, hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze lost in the sprawling city beyond. Aiden stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Julian turned, his face unreadable. "I have a project," he said, his voice measured. "Something that requires discretion." Aiden nodded, heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Julian moved to his desk, pulling out a slim folder. He placed it carefully on the polished surface, but didn't open it. Instead, he looked at Aiden, really looked as if searching for something beyond the surface. "This isn't like the others," he continued. "It's delicate. It needs someone I can trust completely." The weight of his words settled between them, thick and undeniable. Aiden felt the enormity of what Julian was asking. Not just trust in a professional sense, but something deeper, something that blurred the lines they had tried so hard to maintain. He stepped closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name. Julian didn't move, but his gaze sharpened, locking onto Aiden's with an intensity that made the air between them feel thin. No promises were made, no contract signed. The understanding passed silently between them, carried in a look, in the steady beat of shared breath. Aiden reached for the folder, his fingers brushing against Julian's for the briefest moment. The contact was electric, sending a shiver up his spine. He held Julian's gaze, letting the silence say what words could not. Julian gave a small nod, a silent acceptance of Aiden's unspoken answer. That night, Aiden stayed late again. He sat at his desk long after the office had emptied, the folder unopened before him. He knew that crossing this line would change everything. Yet he felt no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that had been building since the moment they first locked eyes across the lobby. As midnight approached, Aiden rose from his chair, slipping the folder into his bag. The city outside was a blur of lights and motion, but inside, the office was a cocoon of stillness. He made his way to the elevators, but instead of pressing the button for the ground floor, he paused. His reflection stared back at him in the polished metal doors, a reminder of the choice he was about to make. The soft ding of an arriving elevator broke the silence. Aiden turned, half expecting to see Julian, but the car was empty. Still, the moment felt significant, a point of no return. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain on the wind. Aiden pulled his coat tighter around him and started walking, his mind racing with possibilities. with the uncharted territory that lay ahead. He didn't hear Julian approach until he was almost beside him, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm without a word exchanged. They walked together in silence, the city unfolding around them in endless patterns of light and shadow. It felt natural, inevitable, as if this was where they were always meant to end up, side by side, moving forward into something neither of them could fully define. As they reached a quiet intersection, Julian finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Aiden turned to him, finding a depth of emotion in Julian's eyes that mirrored his own. There was fear there, and hope, and something achingly real. He nodded, unable to find his voice, but knowing that no words were necessary. Julian offered a faint, almost wistful smile, then continued walking. Aiden followed without hesitation, leaving behind the safe, predictable path he had once envisioned for himself. Ahead of them, the city pulsed with life and possibility. And somewhere within that vast unknown, a new future waited, uncertain, risky, and utterly theirs. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Aiden moved through the office with careful precision, maintaining the rhythms of work while a different current ran quietly beneath the surface. Every glance exchanged across the conference room, every accidental brush of hands over the same blueprint seemed weighted with meaning. Yet no one else seemed to notice. To the outside world, they were simply two colleagues, no different from anyone else. But Aiden felt it. He felt it in the way Julian's gaze would linger half a second longer than necessary, in the way his voice would soften ever so slightly when speaking to him. It was not something tangible, nothing he could point to and name. It lived in the spaces between words, in the silences too full to be accidental. Late one evening, after most of the team had left, Aiden found himself once again staying behind. The office was dim and quiet, the hum of the city outside filtering in through the tall windows. He had meant to finish a proposal, but concentration had long since abandoned him. He sensed Julian's approach before he heard it. Turning slightly in his chair, he caught sight of him standing a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his slacks, a contemplative expression shadowing his features. "Walk with me," Julian said simply. There was no hesitation. Aiden grabbed his jacket and followed. They left the building through a side entrance, the night air crisp against Aiden's face. The streets were quieter than usual, the city settling into its late-night rhythm. They walked side by side without speaking, the distance between them charged with a tension that neither dared to break too soon. Aiden could feel Julian's presence like a magnetic pull, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Each step forward felt like shedding another layer of caution, peeling back the careful professional facade he had worn for so long. They ended up at a small park tucked between high-rise buildings, a hidden patch of green in the heart of steel and glass. Julian led the way to a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, and they sat, still silent, the world around them muted and distant. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the quiet stretching between them, fragile and heavy all at once. Then Julian spoke, his voice low. "Sometimes," he said, staring straight ahead, "we build walls to protect ourselves, to keep things simple, safe." Aiden said nothing, sensing that this wasn't the kind of conversation that needed interruptions. But eventually, Julian continued, "Those walls stop keeping things out. They start keeping us trapped inside." The admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Aiden turned his head slightly, studying Julian's profile in the dim light. There was a vulnerability there he hadn't seen before, a crack in the polished armor. Aiden thought about the past few weeks, the stolen glances, the silent invitations, the subtle gestures of care and trust. They had been dancing around something real, something that scared them both. Drawing in a breath, Aiden spoke, his voice just above a whisper. "I don't want walls between us." The words trembled in the air, but he didn't pull them back. Julian finally turned to look at him, and in his eyes, Aiden saw a flicker of something unspoken, relief, maybe, or gratitude. Or perhaps just the acknowledgement of how far they'd come to reach this fragile, terrifying moment. They didn't move closer, didn't reach for each other. Not yet. The moment was too sacred for anything so bold. But the understanding between them deepened, solidified by the honesty that had finally broken through the silence. They sat together for a long time, letting the city breathe around them, letting the weight of the unsaid settle into something steady and real. When they finally rose to leave, it was with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. They walked back through the sleeping city, side by side, no longer separated by invisible walls. Something fundamental had shifted, something no one else could see, but that changed everything. Aiden knew, deep down, that there was still uncertainty ahead, still risks to be taken. But for the first time, he felt ready. Ready to step into the unknown, not alone, but with someone walking beside him. The night closed around them as they moved forward, their footsteps light against the pavement, carrying them toward whatever came next, together. The weekend passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Aiden found himself moving through familiar routines with a sense of detachment, as though the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Nothing outwardly had changed, yet inside him, everything felt different. The conversation in the park lingered in his mind, replaying in fragments whenever he let his thoughts drift. The walls had cracked, and through them, something raw and real had begun to emerge. Monday arrived with a gray sky and a steady drizzle that blurred the city into watercolor shapes. Aiden rode the elevator up to the office, heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. He told himself he would act normal, that professionalism would shield him from the uncertainty knotting his chest. But as soon as the elevator doors slid open and he stepped into the hallway, he knew that pretending would be impossible. Julian was waiting near the entrance, speaking quietly with a colleague. His eyes flicked up, catching Aiden's for the briefest of seconds. In that glance, there was no hesitation, no masks, just recognition, a quiet agreement that what had passed between them wasn't going to be buried beneath the weight of routine. The morning unfolded with a kind of fragile normalcy. Emails, meetings, the shuffle of papers, and muted conversations. Yet every moment was laced with a heightened awareness, as if the world around them had faded slightly, leaving only the unspoken thread that connected them. Around midday, Aiden found himself called into a project meeting led by Julian. He slid into a seat at the long table, acutely aware of Julian's presence at the head. They discussed deadlines, resource allocations, upcoming client presentations, the usual cadence of business. But Aiden noticed the way Julian's gaze would settle on him when he spoke, steady and grounding. There was a new kind of trust there, unspoken but tangible, woven into the space between words. It was a quiet promise that whatever they were building between them extended beyond the moments of vulnerability they'd shared. When the meeting ended, the team filtered out, chatting and gathering their notes. Aiden remained behind for a moment longer than necessary, gathering his papers with deliberate slowness. Julian lingered too, pretending to sort documents at the far end of the table. They didn't speak, but when Aiden finally moved toward the door, Julian's hand brushed lightly against his arm in passing. The contact was fleeting, almost invisible, but it sent a rush of warmth through Aiden's veins. The days that followed were marked by these small, wordless exchanges. A glance across the office, a brush of fingers when handing over a file, a lingering presence at the coffee machine. They built something delicate, layer by layer, without forcing it, without speaking it aloud. Aiden began to see the city differently, too. The rush of people, the glittering lights at dusk, the hidden corners of parks and cafes. It all seemed fuller now, as if the world had been holding its breath and was only just beginning to exhale. Late one evening, as he packed up to leave, Aiden found a folded note tucked beneath his keyboard. The handwriting was unmistakable. Rooftop. His heart stumbled in his chest. He grabbed his jacket and made his way to the stairwell, climbing the narrow flights until he reached the top. The door to the roof was slightly ajar, the city sounds growing louder as he pushed it open. Julian stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, looking out over the skyline. The wind ruffled his hair, and for a moment, he looked younger, less guarded. Aiden stepped forward, letting the door click shut behind him. The air between them was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of rain. They didn't speak. There was no need. Julian turned to face him fully, and the faintest smile curved his lips. It wasn't the polished, professional smile Aiden had seen 100 times before. It was something softer, more real. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until only a breath separated them. There was no hesitation now, no careful calculation, only the quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, they were choosing it together. Aiden felt Julian's hand brush against his, fingers tangling slowly, deliberately. The touch was light, reverent, a promise without words. They stood there as the city pulsed and breathed around them, two figures against a backdrop of endless possibility. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and uncharted, but for the first time, Aiden wasn't afraid. He squeezed Julian's hand gently, and Julian squeezed back, a silent affirmation that they were no longer standing at the edge alone. They had crossed the line, and somewhere in the spaces between city lights and quiet heartbeats, a new beginning had already begun. Goodbye.